Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome back to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Katie Beth Hand. My guest today is a certified financial planner, a certified divorce financial analyst, and the founder of Mindful Divorce Partners, Melissa. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Katie. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you because this is such a unique take on the financial planning space, but also one that is so important. So before we dive in with all of my questions about that, take a few minutes, if you will, and tell us a little bit about your background and what made you want to become a financial planner, and also what made you want to get certified as a divorce financial analyst. There's got to be a story there. So tell us about that.
There definitely is. I always knew I wanted to go into finance. So that was sort of just me geeking out and being a nerd and wanting to be a financial planner. I have that type A personality. So went to school for finance. And then while I was practicing, I was coming across clients who were going through divorce, right? Like, through that early infancy stages of business when you're like, hey, okay, this is like your general client, right? And then it's like, okay, things happen, right? People pass away, people get divorced. And so you sort of walk through life with them as a financial planner. And I learned very early on that financial planning for two people is very different than financial planning for one person, right? The conversation shifts, the runway shifts. And so I really wanted to dive in deep to that. And I go back to my why being my mom. So I'm a child of divorce, and my mom made a lot of decisions with her heart instead of her head. And when I realized that there was a designation just for divorce financial planning, I jumped on it right away. I got my designation back in 2015, and really she's my why behind it, right? Because I want there to be that education piece and that empowerment piece. And a lot of people don't know that we exist, right? A lot of people just go straight to the attorney, and they don't necessarily know that there are sort of experts in these fields. And although divorce is legal, right, it's very much financial, and sometimes the biggest financial transaction of their life.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And I figured there was a very personal reason behind your why. And obviously there is. I do love that you've brought that up. We were talking a little bit before I started the podcast. I'm on the estate planning side of things while you're on the financial side. And so this is something that a lot of people really, like you said, they come to an attorney and they're ready to get a divorce. A lot of times, very emotional decisions get made. There's a mental health aspect of this that's in there, as well as the financial aspect. And so, one thing that I've heard you talk about, and you talk about it a little bit on your website as well, is really looking at this process of helping two people get divorced, but doing it in a very non-adversarial way, if possible, and also addressing it kind of as that holistic approach of talking about attorneys, family law attorneys, maybe I assume mediators are probably part of what you do, mental health as well. Talk to me a little bit about that and why a holistic approach to this piece of someone's life is so important.
Yeah, it's really like my passion. And I just actually authored a book called Divorce by Design. And the whole premise of the book is that team-based approach. And you need to develop and establish your divorce team. And that starts not with an attorney or with a CDFA, but that starts with the emotional support. I think that's first and foremost. You need to be emotionally grounded and ready, right, for this process. And so and I'm sure you've seen this, that people just jump straight to the attorney right away. And when people even come to me right away and I can tell that they're emotionally not regulated, we pause and we say, hey, let's take a break here. Let's, find you. Do you have a therapist? Do you have a divorce coach? Like, let's start there. And then when you're ready, come back to me and I'm here for you. And I think that's really important because it's more efficient, right? You don't want to make long-term financial decisions in heightened emotional states. A lot of people do it. People come to me, and when they're at that point of, I don't care, I just want this done, right? That's the most expensive sentence you can make in divorce. That's the time where I call it the power of the pause, where you just have to say, all right, let's take a break. Let's take a breather. Let's sleep on it. Let's, whatever you have to do, go for a walk, meditate, because this is where you are trying to stop short-term pain and it might have long-term repercussions. So I think it's really important to have that team approach. Not one person is like the end all be all, right? We all sort of can stay in our lane and really support through this process. And I love doing it in an amicable fashion if possible. There's a lot of outside of court options, right? Whether that's mediation, whether that's collaborative divorce. There's actually a new method out there called Soul Agree, which is like mediation and collaborative with an arbitration at the end, but still guaranteeing that we're not going to be in a courtroom. And I think it's in everyone's best interest, right, to not have a judge in a black robe who doesn't know you or your family make decisions about your future.
No, that makes so much sense. I love the holistic approach. And so it's interesting because in my experience, probably there are a lot of legal issues that can be very emotional for people. Even on the estate planning side, when someone passes and having to do that or find out you have to go to probate, like there are a lot of emotions that come with that. I would bet probably I would bet that the divorce is probably one of the most emotional times to be making legal decisions because there's so many. It's not just loss, it's the loss of your marriage, it's the loss of that spouse combined with anger, frustration, betrayal, resentment, whatever else might be there. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a lot. I mean, probably more than any other area of law. That's a lot of very heightened emotions that are coming into play at a time when you really can't make emotional decisions. So, very interesting, like outlook that you have on this. And I love that there's even a designation for that. I did not know that. You're the first CDFA that I've ever met. It's really cool that it exists. So tell us if there's someone who's listening and they are about to go through a divorce or they're about to get separated or they're starting this process. Do you work with both spouses? Do you work with one spouse? What does that process look like if there's someone out there that's about to go through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a CDFA, we can work nationwide. So it doesn't have to be somebody in your state. And we can be both a neutral or an advocate. So when I am brought in as a neutral, I work for the family as a whole, right? Both parties, similar to a mediator, sign a participation agreement. And I am not working for one or the other, but sort of solving the family's outlook as a whole and looking at their finances together. This saves time, money, and energy because, if you go to an attorney, one of the first things they ask is sort of that financial affidavit and going through financial discovery. So instead of two people paying their attorney, right, or the paralegal to do that, you can have one person do it together, right? And it just saves time, money, and energy right off the bat by, being transparent and getting the financials organized. And in that case, I very much like to preface everything sort of through the lens of the children, right? At the end of the day, you want to make sure that there are two households, if children are involved, that these kids can go to and that their parents are going to be okay, right? And so there's that same sort of nest egg of income coming in, right? But our expenses actually go up in divorce. They don't go down, right? So nobody wins. But we're trying to figure out a way in which both people will be okay in the process. So that's the neutral work that we do. And then as an advocate, if somebody were to say, hey, I haven't been the CFO of our family, right? I left that to my spouse. I focused either on my career or I took a step away from my career and I focused on the children and, the home. And now this is happening and I don't really quite understand all of the terminology, right? I might not be privy to all of the investments or the documents or all of who the professionals are sort of in our life because my spouse might have taken care of that. That is when you might want an advocate. And as an advocate, I work for just you in your corner, and I'm looking to see what is in your best interest, right? So just like as if you were to hire an attorney, they have your back. So I become your eyes and your ears. And I think that's really important. And I can still be an advocate in an amicable process. Just because I'm an advocate doesn't mean we're going to war. It just means that I'm doing a thorough check of what's going on. And my role is to make sure that you don't sign something that you don't understand. And I think that happens, unfortunately, more times than not. And I'm sure you see it, Katie, right, in the work that you do too. People sign things and they don't necessarily understand the long-term repercussions of them.
Right. No, and I love that you touched on that. I think that happens all too often. Probably, I would say statistically, probably a lot more with women because in not all certainly, but in many households, men tend to do more of the financial piece. Women do some of the other things, not always, but sometimes. And so I would imagine a lot of the clients that you advocate are women who sometimes are not like in my family growing up, dad did all the finances. Mom worked, but he paid the bills and she did other things. And so even as an adult, like when I was helping them with their estate plan, my mom sat down at that table for the very first time and she was like, I mean, she was in her mid 60s and she said, I don't know anything about our finances. I don't know where all the
Yeah.
bank accounts are. I don't. And so for her, and luckily they weren't getting a divorce, but so he was on her side trying to loop her in. But I can only imagine how incredibly overwhelming that feels on top of the emotional devastation and trying to protect your kids and all of that. And some of these decisions that you're helping people work through, they can have long-term financial consequences, especially if you're talking about some sort of like coming to some sort of settlement. So, how do you help people figure out the best source or the best way to get things settled for them? And you're welcome to tell an example story of some clients you've been able to help like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's so important. And I think a lot of people come into this with so many feelings, right? You sort of touched on that earlier about there's guilt, there's resentment, there's betrayal, there's loss of trust. And so now sort of battling all of that in the background, right? So you want to make sure you're grounded before you go, through this process, starting with that emotional support. But when we're with the finances and I'm going through it, I really try to focus on the education piece, right? Because maybe similar to your mom, right? It's not that she didn't know, right? Or she was kept from her. Sometimes it is that, there's financial abuse and information is kept. But in most cases, we sort of just fall into our family routines, right? And it's surprisingly the gender roles have sort of changed like lately, right? And a lot of like my female clients are now the breadwinners, right? And they're sort of the ones with the higher assets and they sometimes now are having to pay support, to their husbands in some cases. But historically, right, the wives kind of stayed at home and took care of the family. And even if they worked, the husbands were, talking to the accountant or talking to the financial advisor, and that sort of has happened. And I think when I speak to whoever's the non-CFO spouse, female or male, there's a lot of shame there. Like, how did I get this? I don't know how to answer these questions, right? When you go to the attorney and they give you that financial affidavit, it feels like an SAT test, right? Like you are just like automatically frozen. And I think that's where that team approach really comes in to say, hey, I'm going to hold your hand and I'm going to walk you through this. Like, let's make this a conversation, not a test. If we don't know all the answers, that's okay. We're going to find out. I can help you look, right? And I am sort of creative in ways that we can find out where some of this data is. I laugh because back in the day, right, you can sort of just like go check the mailbox and like say, oh, this is our mortgage statement or oh, this is this. But nowadays with technology, everything's electronic. There's two-factor authentication. I joke because I can barely get into my own email account, let
Right.
alone try to like break into my husband's, right? Because there's
Yeah.
always like sending codes and passwords. And
Right. He would
so,
know for sure if you were trying to get into
yeah,
his, for sure. Yeah.
exactly. But I think we start there with just saying, like, hey, today is ground zero. You're always going to know more about this at the end of this process, right? Like you might not be coming in, but let's go in with eyes wide open and let's learn about it. And I create a really safe space for people to ask questions. And I go through the statements, right? A lot of times people are intimidated. And just like in the legal world, in the finance world, there's a lot of jargon, right? And there's a lot of like acronyms and there's a lot of like, fast paced talking that you and I sort of understand and know sort of like the back of our hand. But to others, it's sort of and you can start to see. So I really try to slow the process down. I really try to explain what they have and what it means. I always say you need to know 5 numbers: the assets of what you own, the liabilities of what you owe, income of what is being earned, the expenses of what you're spending, and your credit score. And I help you build those numbers, right? And then as the time goes on, I start to see whoever the non-CFO spouse is have a little bit more confidence, right? They feel a little bit more empowered because they're understanding it. And we're creating that safe space to ask questions and comprehend it. And then they can have an opinion, right, on what moves forward. Because oftentimes when you're not regulated, you become in that fight or flight, or freeze state, right? Where you don't know what to do either. And sometimes you just become paralyzed. And a lot of times I think divorces take so long often because of that. Just like they're frozen. They don't know how to move it forward. So I try to just make sure that everyone knows what they're agreeing to. It's okay if it's not the best financial decision, right? It's all not numbers. And I say that some of these things are very emotional. But if you're going to say, hey, I want to keep the house, I need to make sure that you understand what it costs to keep this house, right? Not that you're just not ready to move yet or you don't want to disrupt your family or your kids, but that in the long term, you are going to not regret keeping this house and that you can afford the house and not just the principal and the interest and the homeowner's insurance, but you can afford if the roof breaks, right? Is there an emergency fund and some liquidity here? Because I don't want you to become house poor through this process.
Right. Well, and there's so much. I love that you touch on that. There's so much when that's not something you typically think about. We're going through this process. We have a kid heading to college. So we're starting to talk about what life expenses actually look like. Growing up, everything's included, right? It's just free. He lives here and there's always food, there's always paper towels. The trash just the guys just come.
Magic.
None of these things are ever really something that you think about. And so that can be true. A lot of people kind of go from living with parents to might get married young and it's not something they've ever really done or thought about in years and years. And so I like that you talk clients through, hey, yes, you want to keep the house, but it's more than just your mortgage. It's insurance, it's trash service, it's can you afford a plumber if something breaks? I mean, there's so many different pieces that go into that. And I love the term house poor. We have clients come in and that's an issue. And insurance poor, they're so overinsured on things that they're barely making. It's very interesting the different ways that you can get into financial trouble if you don't really take the time to think that through. So I
Yeah.
like that you're helping explain that. The other thing I see with our clients that come in, I'd be interested to hear from your side. We have a lot of clients that come in that are almost embarrassed to be there. They're intimidated by attorneys and they're almost I wish our finances were in better shape, or I wish we'd saved more, or I wish we owned more. Do we even need estate planning? We're not multimillionaires. And so there's almost that sense of shame when they come in where they're afraid that they're not worth our time. Is that something you ever deal with your clients?
Yeah, a lot of times with, just money in general, I think that there's a lot of shame in that. And we don't really talk about money often, right? It's very private. And so when somebody comes to me, whether it's on the financial planning side or the divorce side, right, I say we're going to get financially naked together. This is a judgment-free zone. I am here, right, in your best interest. I have seen a lot, right? It's sort of like when you go to the gynecologist, right? It's just sort of like, okay,
It's
it's
every day's
no big deal.
business.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
First time's a little weird, but then after that, it's sort of par for the course.
Right.
And so yes, there is a lot of shame. And I wish and I hope, right, that couples who are listening to this podcast who are not ready for divorce, right? Just have more financial talks, right? I think a lot of divorce could be avoided if there was more transparency. And I like to encourage like my planning clients to like have a quarterly date night, right? Get a bottle of wine, get your favorite takeout, talk about it, right? Pull out the balance sheet, look at your taxes. Is there like a home renovation? Is there, is there, are you on track for like your retirement goals? And have that. It doesn't have to be a terrible, conversation or one that you're being reactive, right? It's much better to be proactive in these cases than reactive. And estate planning goes into that. I think that on my side, specifically the divorce side, people skip that step, right? And I'm curious to hear a story from you about what that looks like, because I always say, like, do you want your ex to be like, we have to, there's a point that like, okay, the divorce is done, right? The ink is, the judge signed, we're divorced. And then it's sort of like, there's a grieving process, right? Sort of like similar to when somebody passes away, where like everyone else goes back to normal, but your life is completely upside down still. And I think, this is like the work that I really love doing is that post-divorce work, because I will go to the estate planning attorney with my clients who are going through divorce, right? Because now they have to say, like, who is my new power of attorney? Who is my new healthcare proxy, right? Like, who am I now leaving all of my assets to? God forbid something happens to me. And those are hard conversations to have.
They are hard conversations, and I'm so glad that you brought back up. I want to circle back in just a second about post-divorce financial planning, because that's kind of a whole different piece when you have clients coming in for that. But, it's interesting on the estate planning side. I could tell you a million horror stories of people that have their estate plan done as a couple, which is great, and you should. But when you don't update that, this is why holistic planning is so important. When you don't update that, when we don't have a relationship with the financial advisor, and then you get divorced, and then maybe one spouse even gets remarried, but documents are never changed. We have had so many issues where people come in and sometimes it's medical, like it's the new wife and she shows up at the hospital after her husband has a stroke and does not have the medical power
Healthcare
of
proxy, yeah.
attorney, or even listed on any HIPAA form anywhere. And so who's listed there? The ex-wife. Well, that is just, it's very dramatic episode that happens, right? It's a soap opera.
Yeah.
But some simple planning on that, and that's why we love to work with people's financial advisors, because there's also a lot of things when it comes to estate planning that people forget to tell us. So if we are grouped in with their financial advisor, with their CPA, then we can get a really good, clear picture of whether it's a couple or someone who's finished a divorce or someone who's single, whoever it is, we can get a much better picture of where they really are and where we need to get them to. So
Yeah.
holistic planning is so important. But yes, I could tell you 1,000 horror stories about cases where the ex-wife gets everything, or where the current wife is not listed on any of the documentation, or the retirement account that goes to the ex. There's so much drama, and it can be easily avoided, but you have to be proactive. And I think post-divorce, that's what's so important about what you do, Melissa. Post-divorce, once the things are signed, people like to say, okay, I'm just going to take a break for a little while and
Yeah.
recalibrate, and then you never come back.
Yeah.
And so
There's
that's
a
what,
whole like list of things that you have to do after, and nobody's really there to walk you through them, right?
right.
It's sort of like your attorney's done with you, like, yeah, it's so important. And I think that that beneficiary piece, right? You sometimes they're not ready yet, right? But I go, divorced or not, my financial planning clients or my divorce clients, I sit with them in that room just for that purpose of like, I know the peripheral information, right? The data that they might not bring to you that's really important. Is there a special needs children, right? Is there an inheritance that like is sort of off the table? Is there low cost basis in the house? Like all of these things play into the estate planning that you do. And I like, it's one of the first parts. I'm like, I need to know who your CPA is and who your estate planning attorney is. And if you don't have one, then let's find you one, because the three of us have to work together. And I think that's so powerful when you have your professionals talk to one another, because everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. I agree with that from the flip side of things, 100%. So let's say there's someone out there who has just gone through a separation or has just gone through a divorce, and they are in the process of rebuilding life. Talk to me about post-divorce financial planning and how that's different from maybe someone who's always been single. What does the post-divorce financial planning process really look like?
Yeah, it really depends upon like how old they are and like where they are. Like, if do they have children? How young are their children for what that sort of to-do list looks like for them? But I do have a checklist for the post-divorce essentials, sort of going through like what you have to do emotionally, financially, and then legally. And one of them is update the beneficiaries, right? Make sure that you meet with your estate planning attorney and update all those documents because that is so important. And I think it's honestly more important than the investment piece, right? Like people come to me and say, all right, like I want you to be my financial planner. Okay, now I have this lump sum of money, or how am I going to, am I on track for retirement? And I often pump the brakes and I say, we're not doing any of this yet until we get the right docs in place. And they kind of look at me like, why? Like, don't you want to do this? Like, this is what you do. But none of what I do matters, right? If we don't go to you first and if we don't have that estate plan. So I think there's an order of operations that people don't always attend to, but I really try to make sure that we, as the professionals, do what's best for our client. And that is making sure that we're there. Once we're set up like with the estate plan, then I'll dive into sort of that post divorce. The cash flow is super important because again, we now are running a household on one income, right? And so that looks very different. There's a couple of things like mistakes that people make. Oftentimes, if there is support, whether it's child support or maintenance, alimony, whoever the pay or is supposed to have a life insurance policy, right? To, if God forbid something were to happen to them, to pay that obligation. It's always written in these divorce decrees, and very often is it enforced, right? Someone might say, oh, yeah, I have a group term policy at work. Great. Who's going to know about it? Right? You can easily call HR and change that beneficiary to the new girlfriend, right? Or you can switch jobs, right? Or you can get fired, or you can get laid off, or you can get retired, right? And then there's no protection for your family. So part of what I do is not just the investment piece, it's really just making sure we dot our I's and cross our T's, right? All of those little things, the devil's in the details, making sure that their beneficiaries are updated, making sure if we can add transfer on death or payable on death to any account so that we can maybe avoid probate, right? All of those things matter, and making sure that cash flow is really accurate because we might have to reel it in, right? And that first year after divorce is always a little wonky, right? Your taxes look a little weird, your cash flow, there's a lot of outflow, whether it be legal expenses, financial expenses, moving, furnishing a new place, whatever that looks like, it's a lot. So it takes a little while to get back into the rhythm of things. And I really encourage people to meet with a CFP to make sure that, again, we're doing that holistic planning so that we get back on track, right? You might have taken some time off from investing or, in your retirement accounts because there was so much sort of expenses going out. But let's see now that are we on track to retire? Let's put in looking at what Social Security looks like, right? Looking at all those different income streams and also just making sure that if there is a financial obligation from the payor to the payee, that's protected by insurance and insurance that not cannot like disappear overnight.
No, that makes so much sense. And again, that's a piece of the puzzle most people don't think about. Probably especially coming out of a divorce when your energy is just at an all-time low, you're emotionally exhausted. And I can see how that piece gets skipped. And then it's like with everything with estate planning, once something happens, it's too late to go back and fix
Yeah.
it. And so
Yeah.
I feel like that's the thing all of these pieces have in common is the earlier you can tackle it, the more options you have, the better outcome you can have when it comes, whether it's getting your finances in order with a CFP or whether it is getting your estate plan done. Those things, there's so many options on the front end. And I'd like to tell our clients, it's also a lot less expensive on the front end. Our highest paid attorney is our probate attorney. And so that's what happens if you don't have any planning done, you're going to pay for it one way or the other, but it's a
Yeah.
lot easier on the front end. And so having someone like you out there for the financial piece where they can go and get help and get some good information. This is typically everybody's first time to go through this process, and it's a process where they don't want to be. So it's tough to get good information for sure. Okay, before we run out of time, talk to me about, and this might be the hardest question I've asked you. So, through the work that you do, both as a CFP and a CDFA, through the work that you do, what is it that you hope that your legacy will be?
I think it will be that communication around money. I think that if we can get rid of that stigma that money has to be so private and we don't talk about it, and that how we have our own relationship with money, right? What does money mean to you? And I think that if we all sort of put some time and energy there, we can just have a better relationship with money and possibly lower divorce rates. And I would really like that.
That is a fantastic, fantastic legacy. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Well, if you are thinking about it or have a friend thinking about it, I did just write a book called Divorce by Design, which is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So would love some support as a new author. And I think that if you are contemplating divorce, it doesn't have to destroy you, right? We can do it in a way that's amicable and that you become educated throughout the process.
I love that. I love the hopeful view that you put on to something that is typically very difficult, very dark. Well, for our listeners, this has been the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Katie Beth Hand. And my guest today was Melissa Pavone. And to learn more and connect with Melissa, you can find her at mindfuldivorcepartners.com. I will link that for you in the show notes, along with the link to the book, Divorce by Design. So be sure, if this is something you're going through or something that you have a good friend going through, be sure to grab a copy of that. Melissa, thank you for taking time today to jump on with me and share all of your wisdom and secrets. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.